Again, welcome everyone for joining us tonight. Sam Cody is going to be presenting. He is NICHES Volunteer and Outreach Coordinator. He joined our organization initially as an intern and then became a full-time staff member in 2019, but I'm going to go ahead and let him share a little bit more about himself and share with you what the work that he's doing for the organization.
All right, thank you very much, Julie. So as Julie mentioned, I am the Volunteer and Outreach Coordinator with NICHES. I am the first Volunteer and Outreach Coordinator with NICHES. This will be my third year working. And then before that, I was an intern for 2 summers working under Nissa Lilovich, who is the communication director. And I was lucky enough to sort of move into her position. But when I did so, it was sort of restructured to have more of a focus on volunteers and being able to plug folks into our stewardship goals. And NICHES protects over 3,500 acres, and we have 2 stewards who are responsible for doing all the work on that. And it's not too complex math to realize that you're going to need a small army of people to make these places as environmentally viable as possible for native plants and animals. So that is my job. So I'm going to be talking today about our volunteer and outreach program. I sort of have it structured towards folks who might be interested in volunteering. So I'll be going through different things that show up during the calendar year and different ways to get involved with NICHES, and just sort of talking about the general concept of building a community around this idea of land protection and getting people plugged into that. Let's see if it advances to the next slide. That would be useful. There we go. So I'm going to start off simply with just answering the question of what is a land trust. A land trust, simply put, is a nonprofit organization that is directly involved in the permanent protection of land for its resources and for the public benefit. At NICHES, that it obviously extends for environmental benefit. It's basically an organization that exists to retire land, to pull land out of development. And some land trusts don't have as big of a focus on stewardship, but that's one of the major focuses at NICHES, is actually going out, trying to find what's out of balance in the ecosystem and work to make that not so. So it's usually done through our fire program, recycling nutrients, helping sort of bring balance back to oak hickory systems. It's done through removing invasive species is one of the major things that we do. And that's something we need a lot of hands throughout the year to help with. And land trusts accept donations of land or properties. We buy land. We have a limited acquisition budget that we use throughout the year to buy land as it comes up. We usually have a pretty big focus on land that is adjoining other pieces of property. The reason we do that is it helps reduce the amount of edge habitat on the properties, and invasive species are known to sort of populate those edges, and the larger nucleus of land you have, the more usable it is for some of your larger animals like bobcats and stuff like that. We also help landowners establish legal restrictions on their land that limit the harmful use and development. And this is done through something called an easement, which is essentially a landowner can give over the development rights of their land to the land trust. And obviously the land trust will decide not to develop the land. So it's something where the landowner can retain some of the value of their land. They can even sell it, but whoever they're selling it to understands that you wouldn't be able to build any additional structures on the land. And sort of the main tenet behind land trust is land is protected forever. The idea is land trusts can only grow, not shrink. NICHES started 25 years ago, now over 25 years ago, with 0 acres, and we're now over 3,500. And it's exciting to think where we're going to be at year 50 and year 100 and many years past when I'm gone. And hopefully we're going to be many, many thousands of acres past where we are now. So I'll dive a little bit into the history of land trusts. At least in the United States, land trusts sort of began with this guy on the left here named Charles Eliot, who sort of became an adult during the late 1800s, which was when America was really going through its industrial revolution. He was also at one of the sort of epicenters of the Industrial Revolution, living in Boston. And he published an article in 1890 in the periodical Gardens and Forests, titled Waverly Oaks, that was sort of a reflective piece, talking about, actually it was one of the few remaining stands of large oak trees in the town. And he was talking about protecting that, and the wording that he used that I really like was protecting special bits of scenery that held uncommon beauty and more than usual refreshing power. So he sort of proposed that idea in this article. It began to gain traction. And just a year later, in 1891, the Trustees of Public Reserves was created in Boston, which was our nation's first land trust. So by the mid-1900s, several dozen land trusts had popped up across the United States with the same goal in mind, to protect these special bits of land. And currently, 100 years later, there's now 1,200 land trusts in operations across the United States. And 400 of those are currently accredited by the Land Trust Accreditation Commission, which is essentially just a different set of standards. It's a higher set of standards that land trusts are held to, and they have to go through an annual audit. And NICHES is currently accredited by the Accreditation Commission. This is a map of land trusts in Indiana. If you look up in the northwestern corner, this sort of olive drab green color is NICHES service area. I believe we've actually added 1 or 2 counties since this map was made. But we're headquartered in Tippecanoe County, and our headquarter property is actually Clegg Memorial Garden, where I am giving this talk today. And if anyone has not been out there, we have a fantastic trail crew that meets almost every Saturday during the growing season to make sure that our trails are in tip-top shape. It's one of our most sort of involved trail systems, so I highly recommend getting out and hiking and enjoying that. So NICHES Land Trust specifically, we were opened to the public on Earth Day in 1996, and we were actually founded in 1995, which made 2020 our 25th anniversary. And if you ask Julie, that's not a wonderful year to have a 25th anniversary. We had a bunch of plans, and immediately when COVID happened, a lot of those flew out the window. But luckily, we had the benefit of being an outdoor organization, so we were still able to pull out a really nice anniversary, and just sort of pivoted a lot of stuff to outside, which is, I guess, how it should be for a land trust. Like I mentioned before, we operate in a 13-county service area that's centered in Lafayette, West Lafayette. We're currently protecting over 3,500 acres. I believe the number is closer to 3,600 or 3,700. We operate with a 15-member volunteer board of directors, and we currently have 6 full-time staff members, including our executive director, Gus Nyberg, our development director, Julie Rupsum, who is currently hosting this Zoom presentation, an administrative manager, Brett Swan, a volunteer and outreach coordinator, who I've heard is quite a cool guy. And we have 2 stewardship managers, Bob Easter and Justin Harmison. And as I mentioned before, if you look up and do the math on that 3,500 acres, I think that comes out to 1,500 plus something like that acres that they are each responsible for stewarding, which is a massive amount of land. So that's why our organization relies heavily on an army of volunteers that we use throughout the year to do some of those stewardship tasks, to make sure that we're doing as much as we can to make sure that these properties are as functional as possible for native plants and animals. Volunteers have always been a really important part of NICHES, even since the beginning. It was actually a totally volunteer-led organization for over the first decade of its existence. And the amount of volunteers that have been engaging has just been growing and growing every year, and we're really thankful to have them. So what does volunteering with NICHES look like? I'm going to be going into sort of the calendar of stewardship, different things that pop up throughout the year that people can join us, get involved, and get out and help us accomplish some of these tasks. Something that actually happened with COVID that is helping us structure our volunteer program is we now require folks to sign up. So we've been promoting a lot of weekend volunteer work days that are currently limited to 12 people per workday. So those are our public volunteer days. Usually during the growing season, we're looking to hopefully have at least one of those per weekend, 3 or 4 per month. We have a group of independent volunteers that work across our properties. These are folks who maybe aren't as interested in the volunteer workdays or the group volunteer workdays and who rather be working alone. Oftentimes, these are people who are neighbors to the properties, who just enjoy hiking and are kind enough to help us maintain the trails. We have a hunting program that takes place in the month of November. I'll dig a bit into this later in the presentation, but this is a win-win for NICHES because hunting itself is a volunteer activity. It reduces deer populations that are overpopulated, which helps reduce browsing in the understory. But we also, since it's a privilege to be hunting on a protected piece of land, we actually ask our hunters to do some work throughout the year, and they're usually very helpful at getting some of their equipment and knowledge out to help us. And we actually just had a massive trash cleanup at our biggest preserve, Shawnee Bottoms, just a few weekends ago, where we removed over, I think, 60 cubic tons of trash from just old trash piles that were out in the woods. Another big source of volunteer hours that we get throughout the year is through our summer interns. Usually each summer we're lucky enough to have a couple interns, usually from nearby colleges like Purdue or Wabash. We actually had an intern last summer, Catherine Fisher, who is from DePaul University, who was studying abroad in Peru, and COVID totally shut everything she was doing down. And she worked through the woodwork and made her way to NICHES, and she ended up being a fantastic intern. We also will work with Americorps crews or other work groups. I'm actually currently working with an Americorps crew now, a 9-person, it's NCCC Oak 5. We actually just planted 455 trees today out at Beinecke Preserve and Parker's Indian Creek Basin. So that's just a service program, and they come out and help us with our sort of seasonal tasks as they come up. And we also have a burn program where we go out to our properties, put fire on the ground, do controlled burns. I'll sort of go into the details of that later, but that's another large source that we reach out for volunteers and that they help us throughout the year. So one of the biggest things that we do, unfortunately, is invasive removal. For anybody who does not know, an invasive species is a non-native species that has some sort of a competitive advantage over native species. One of the best examples of this in this area is honeysuckle. Here soon in the next couple of weeks, it's going to be the first thing in the woods that has leaves, and it will be one of the last things to have leaves in the fall season. It has a huge photosynthetic window. It produces a lot of berries that are really high in sugar, so birds like to eat them even though they're not good for birds, and they easily get spread around on properties and on pieces of land where this invasive species isn't managed. It will grow up, it'll totally overtake the understory. It will block out pretty much 100% of the light once it gets to a certain size. And that chokes out all your spring ephemeral wildflowers. It chokes out pretty much any beneficial native plant that we would have in the understory. So that's something that's really important for us to go out and remove, either mechanically or chemically. One that's coming up here soon is garlic mustard, which is a vegetative plant. So that's something that we can go out and just hand pull, and we don't have to use herbicide. Some of the woodier ones like honeysuckle is something we go out with loppers. Sometimes we have volunteers use brush cutters. We'll actually cut the plant and apply a small amount of herbicide to the stump, which keeps it from resprouting. And then that builds into, then you need to pile up all the downed woody debris, and which makes it easier for our stewards and for wildlife to move through. And the wildlife will also use some of those brush piles to live up underneath. And then we can even, in the springtime, throw the garlic mustard on top of those piles and just sort of roast everything all at one point. So that's something that's one of our biggest focuses with stewardship, is removing invasive species. Coming up here soon in April and May, we're going to be having one of our biggest volunteer pushes of the whole year. It's something we've dubbed the War of the Weeds. This is totally focused on helping protect spring ephemeral wildflowers by pulling the invasive plant garlic mustard. These are some pictures of last year's War of the Weeds. That one in the middle underneath the War of the Weeds hand is actually me sitting on the pile of garlic mustard where we got everything off of the properties and got it all to one central location to do some experimenting on how we can compost this. I'm actually currently working with a Purdue student group, an EPICS program, where we're looking to set up a composting station at our Moyer Gold Preserve, so people can bring that, show up on the property and just bring this to one central area where we can hopefully try composting it. This is something, it'll be going on, I believe, from April 16th to May 16th, every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Every shift, every day has 2 shifts, and one in the morning, one in the afternoon. They're each 3 hours long, and every shift is limited to 12 people. And I would really, really love to see every shift get filled. If we can do that, that would provide over 1,000 hours for the organization during a really critical stewardship window. I believe we just got over 500 pledged hours for this event. And it's something we're going to be promoting here extra hard soon. Some other invasive removal efforts, honeysuckle cutting and stacking, like I mentioned before. Queen Anne's lace is a really common invasive species that pops up in our grasslands. So getting out to and removing that. This is a picture from our Swanson's Bluff Preserve in Warren County, where we had a day removing that. And this picture on the right is actually the hand of our stewardship manager, Bob Easter, holding a clump of Japanese stiltgrass. This is something that we are watching. It's sort of an emerging invasive species in this area. In places where it's already been for a long time. If you go down south, you can see areas that are just totally inundated with this plant. It'll cover whole hillsides. So it's something we currently have the upper hand on it, in the sense that it's not fully in this area yet. An invasive species, it's obviously something, if you get to it beforehand and you're able to keep that under control, that's going to save us a lot of work down the line. Another big stewardship push that we have 2 times during the year, the biggest one is in March, is our prescribed fire season. We actually just wrapped up our fire season, and I believe completed over our 100th burn since 2014. This is essentially bringing fire to the landscape for a variety of stewardship reasons. One of the big ones is simply recycling soil nutrients. Doing these fires in wooded areas helps balance out oak versus maple species. To dig in a bit about that, oaks are a fire adapted species and maples are not a fire adapted species. They are both in this area. They are native, they're good trees. But if you don't burn a woodland for a long enough time, the maples, since they're not as fire adapted as oaks, they have different ways of sort of protecting themselves against fire, which is they have a really thick canopy. It blocks almost 90% of the light. If you walk around during the fall time and look underneath a maple tree where all the leaves have fallen, you'll see a big yellow ring, and there won't be that much other than that on the ground, other than just the yellow leaves. Maple leaves aren't very flammable, and they do that essentially to keep fuel away from the base of the trees. Their bark is not as good. Their xylem is much more likely to get roasted if a fire goes through. So they will sort of intentionally block out the light and keep fuel away. And if you aren't burning, they wouldn't be advantages in a normal situation, but if you're not burning, those become competitive advantage. And then those maple trees will sort of overrepresent themselves in the canopy, which has sort of negative effects for the understory, which is sort of what the whole stewardship focus is based on, is for promoting biodiversity in the understory. So that's something we try and bring fire on a regular basis back to our properties. That keeps oaks and oaks and maples balanced. It's something that the Native Americans did in this area. It's pretty much every plant and animal in this area has dealt with that as part of their evolutionary biology. If you go back 200 plus years ago, if a fire started somewhere, it would carry until it hit some body of water. But nowadays, with land being so disjunct and developed, and obviously there's a stigma against fire, and I can't blame anybody for not wanting a fire racing through their subdivision. So we kind of have this stigma against fire. our land. And if something catches on fire, it's not going to be something that will be a natural pressure that these plants have been evolving with for the last million years. So we actually have to go in and do that by hand. We use volunteers to help create fire breaks on the properties, create strips around burn units of non-flammable fuels so we can conduct these safely. We have volunteers on the fire line using flappers and rakes and running our ATV unit and running pretty much every component of the fire. And the more people that we can get on these fires, obviously the more eyes and ears that you have, the safer of a burn you're going to be able to run. One of the big volunteer pushes that we have during normal years for our burn program is our alternative spring break. So this is where we reach out to local colleges, where it's mostly Purdue and Wabash, and we will set this up during their scheduled spring break. And this is an opportunity for students to come out, help us with our burn program, get that experience, work with folks who are red carded, and it's usually environmental science or forestry students who sign up for it. But any day during that week that has the right wind or humidity, we're out burning, and it's a really fun time. Another big thing that NICHES uses volunteers for is our restorations of properties. Say somebody donates a 50-acre farm field, and if NICHES did nothing with that, that would slowly get filled in with invasive species. So you actually have to go out and just treat it like a farm field and plant it, but instead of corn or soybeans, we actually plant it with native grasses and wildflowers, which comes with two things. Native seeds are usually really expensive if you buy them from local nurseries. And another thing we try and do is keep our genetics as local as possible. So we will go to nearby properties, we'll utilize student groups, work groups, weekend volunteer work days, and we try and collect as many of these species as we can, so we can go out and redistribute those to the properties and have those that helps us save money that could otherwise be going to stewardship or land acquisition. And it helps keep all the genetics local, which is a good thing. As I mentioned before, we have a deer thinning program or a hunting program. We had these really useful things 200 years ago called wolves that would go around and larger predators, and that would balance out the larger herbivores like white-tailed deer. And unfortunately, at some point we decided that we didn't want those. And those are now gone from the landscape. So that's another thing that we actually have to go in as an organization and bring that balance back to the landscape. And we do that by deer hunting. So we have neighbors and people who sign up for our hunting program who go out. I believe last year we harvested around 117 deer, and that helps put some sort of pressure on these large herbivore groups, and it keeps them from overgrazing in the understory, and from reducing biodiversity in that sense. If you look at this picture on the right, this is a picture of a deer exclusion zone. So everything on the left is an area where deer can't get into, and everything on the right is an area that deer are just using freely. And you can see how much more biomass is on this left side, and would obviously correlate to more biodiversity on that side. And I really love this picture on the left of this deer just looking at this tree in a cage, and there's nothing else green, and it obviously wants to get in and eat it, but it can't because those trees have been caged, which is something I've been doing a lot of recently with our Americorps crew, is planting and caging trees to keep them protected from deer. Another thing we utilize volunteers for is removing old fencing or structures from our property. This also includes trash cleanups. Obviously, the folks who are coming out to our properties to have hikes or natural experiences, that's detracted from when you're walking by an old rusty fence or a foundation or something like that, or an old trash pile. So we utilize volunteers to go out and to remove all these man-made things from our properties to make the experience as natural as possible. And the more natural the experience people are having on our properties, the more likely they're going to be to come back, to have a positive experience, and to maybe volunteer themselves. We utilize volunteers for creating trails for the public to enjoy. Both of these pictures below are from our Clegg Memorial Garden headquarters. And that's pretty simple. It's just creating areas that are easy for volunteers to get in and utilize and have those natural experiences. And that's, you know, as far as the human component goes, that's what we want, is people going into our properties, having these positive experiences, sharing them with their family and friends and kids, and sort of beginning to create a community around some of these natural places. And in some of our preserves, we've been really lucky to watch really great communities show up around the preserves. Like Frog's Glory is one that pops into my mind, where we have a lot of the neighbors that come out, and they protect the preserve. They do a lot of work on it, and they obviously really appreciate it. Another thing we do is maintain creek access sites, and we run public floats. So these are usually not as large of properties, just along water bodies or local creeks. And this creates a place for the public to get on the creeks and a place for them to get off without trespassing and getting shot at. And obviously these creeks are sort of the main arteries of a lot of our properties. Protecting land along these waterways helps create buffer zones for agrochemicals to filter through, and having these places protected obviously makes the floating experience a lot more natural and fun. And we have something called the Voyage of Discovery that happens each summer, which is I think it's a 4-day, 3-night float that we do, that we open up to the public, and people can join. And we ask them to keep a journal as part of a 100-year project, where we're trying to capture sort of a living history of the creek and people's interaction and the culture that gets built around it. So having these access sites free of garbage, free of graffiti and stuff like that, is something that we rely on our volunteers to help us with. On that same vein, we also have 3 annual creek cleanups that we do, or at least 3 annual creek cleanups. These usually happen in the later summer, August and September. We do creek cleanups on Big Pine Creek up in Warren County, Wildcat Creek down here in Tippecanoe County, and Sugar Creek down in Montgomery County. And every year we pull out an amazing amount of trash. It seems to never stop. I think it's about $3 to get a tire recycled, and unfortunately that's just a bar that's too high for people. So tires get thrown off of bridges and stuff like that all the time. So it's a really fun volunteer activity. Get out on the creek. We fill our boats up with who knows what. One of my favorite stories was 2 years ago. We actually had to bring a chainsaw to cut a porta potty up into 4 different pieces, and I believe that's a chunk of it. On this top middle picture in the back is a chunk of that porta potty. Yeah, just stuff that shows up in the creek, and trying to keep that out. It's obviously reduces pollutants in the creek and makes that a much more natural experience for folks.
Hey, Sam, we had a question come up asking what kind of gear is needed to help with the creek cleanup.
The type of gear, we will provide the boats, we provide the paddles and life jackets. We just need people to show up, and people who don't mind getting dirty and jumping out. And for the most part, we have all the gear in-house that we use for that. Sometimes we use shovels to dig out stuff that's totally just stuck in the riverbank, but for the most part, you just need to sign up for it. And I believe we'll be promoting those here sort of towards the end of the summer. We have the ability to carry 6 canoes, so we'll have about 12 spots on each creek cleanup. We have a summer internship program. As I mentioned before, we're usually lucky to get a couple interns that work with us throughout the summer. Last year, we were working with Zach Neff, pictured on the right, and Catherine Fisher on the left. And these are folks who usually are going to school for forestry or environmental science, and it's an opportunity for them to come and work with us, work with Bob Easter and Justin Harmison, sort of usurp some of their knowledge, learn some of the stewardship techniques firsthand, learn plant identification, and get some of those experiences, be able to put that on their resume. And it's obviously a beneficial symbiotic relationship for us, because we have an extra pair of hands during the growing season, which is the busier time of the year. This picture on the right of Zach Neff, he is actually hand pollinating an orange fringed orchid up at our Fisher Oak Savannah property. This is a state endangered orchid species that we're lucky enough to have on one of our properties. And these populations and plants are so far disparate that it's too far for native pollinators to fly in between these populations and transfer pollen. So we actually have to go in by hand and pollinate these plants. It makes you really, really appreciative of insects who do that all for free. And it sort of makes you realize that insects are probably our #1 volunteering base, and we just we don't really give them the credit that's due. This picture on the left is Justin Harmison and Catherine Fisher removing honeysuckle from our Beinecke Preserve. That's not too far away from Martell in Tippecanoe County. I am currently working with a 9-person Americorps team. This is a service learning organization that young adults sign up for, and they get sent all across the country for different purposes that show up. A lot of them are working hard on the COVID pandemic right now. And we're lucky enough to have a 9-person group that we just finished up our fire season. So all those kids got to go out and have this fire experience. They're helping us plant trees, helping us build trails and stuff like that. So that's a really extensive volunteer thing that we benefit from. And it's usually anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks. And these group sizes range from about 6 to 9 kids, not kids, young adults. This picture on the left is the group that we had last fall at our Frog's Glory Preserve at the frog that we had painted there. And this picture on the right is we were working out at Frog's Glory again just a couple days ago, planting trees and getting them caged to make sure that they weren't being browsed over by deer. NICHES throughout the year has a variety of outreach programs. Obviously with COVID, certain things have been up in the air, but our outreach program is always sort of fluid and evolving. We have different programs that pop up, and we try and utilize the local knowledge that we have in our local area to do some of those. So one of the big ones that I'm lucky enough to do is summer camp. I was really lucky as a kid to have some of my own summer camp experiences and summer nature camp experiences. And it's one of my favorite things. I got to do that while I was an intern and help NISA run our summer camp. And now I believe we're up to 3 weeks, and we have each week set at 11 kids between the ages of 11 and 14. We engage in a variety of citizen science projects as a way for the public to come out and engage in some of the more scientific side of wildlife monitoring and just taking care of the preserves in that way. Throughout the year, we have a variety of nature programs. Some of these have become virtual with COVID, but usually in the spring, we like to do spring wildflower hikes, fall foliar hikes, and getting volunteers, especially the ones who are especially extroverted, to come out and who have a knowledge base and help share that. And we also do a series of floats throughout the year, as I was mentioning before, as a way for people to get out on the water. It's a great way to just sort of disconnect from the world and really appreciate the nature that's around you. So summer camp, here's some pictures of summer camps in years past. This picture in the middle is actually of a place I set up at the Ileana Antique Power Show. All those snake skins that everybody is holding is from a snake that my dad and I, we found a clutch of eggs while we were gardening when I was in 1st grade, and we hatched the snake, and it grew up. It unfortunately died a couple years ago, but we have a large stash of snake skins, and that's something a lot of kids haven't ever experienced. So trying to share some of these natural things, especially with a younger audience. Obviously, these are going to be the people who will be growing up and inheriting this world that we are making and destroying for them simultaneously. So it's a group that I personally feel really connected to, and one that I think is really, really important that we help inspire. This panel here on the right is just a collage of pictures from our summer camp. And it's one of my absolute favorite things that I get to do at the organization. Somehow I've tricked people to pay me into being a kid and playing in the woods for 3 weeks with a bunch of other kids. It's fantastic. Julie, is there a question?
No.
Oh, okay.
I was laughing at your comment.
Here's some more pictures of summer camp. These are all pictures from last year's summer camp. The picture up on the right is actually we hydro dipped coyote skulls. The picture on the bottom right is a float that we did in Wildcat Creek, and we just happened to capture a moment where there's quite a lot of movement going on. Yeah, it's a blast. This year, we just filled up our third week of camp. So week 2 and 3 are full, and I think we have 4 or 5 spots left in our first week of camp. And that's going to be the first, second, and third week of June. And if you have any interest in sharing any of that information or signing a kid up, we have some of that information available on our website and on our Facebook social media. NICHES also engages in a variety of education and outreach programs beyond summer camp throughout the year. Like I mentioned, the Voyage of Discovery earlier, that 4-day, 3-night float, where we just totally disconnect from the world for a while and enjoy Wildcat Creek. We have a Junior Ranger program that we have a couple books that we've developed around Clegg, and we have a book that recently came out that's focused on the Sugar Creek area down at Montgomery County. And this is basically just an activity booklet that gives sort of information for kids to sort of guide their first interactions with nature, and sort of prompts to get them out and to get thinking about stuff like that. We have a variety of nature hikes that we run throughout the year, and we also share information through our Acorn and Sprout newsletters. The Acorn is an e-newsletter, and the Sprout is our paper newsletter that goes out to members. And we're always looking for photographers. We have a fantastic photographer, Chad Phelps, that works with us, who captures a lot of the pictures that go on our Sprout and Acorn. We have people who write stories, people who are doing research, who want to share components of that. It's a platform for us to sort of share what our membership base is doing and how they're interacting with the properties. So if you ever have a reflection or anything you would like to send me, I do both of those, and I would be happy to include anything like that in the Acorn or Sprout newsletters. We have some citizen science programs that we've done in the past. This picture on the left is of a monarch tagging that we did at our Granville Sand Barrens property last summer, which is essentially a citizen science project through the University of Kansas, where we have tags. We collect monarch butterflies, tag them, and they continue on their southern migration down to Mexico. And as those butterflies get recaptured, it provides data for them to triangulate and do science magic that all goes above my head. But this picture in the middle is our saw-whet owl banding program we had last fall. That was open. We had that as a sort of a volunteer and donor appreciation event. Saw-whet owls, that picture, or the owl that the young lady is holding, is actually as large as they get. That's their full adult size. And these are owls that move through oak and hickory forests. They fly actually relatively low in the forest, and you can set up mist nets and capture them. And it's a way to sort of give back to our volunteers to have these events set up, and they're already active people who are engaging in nature, and it's a way to sort of show them a deeper look into nature and sort of some of the fruits of their own labor. This picture on the right is a BioBlitz that NICHES ran a couple years ago. And that's essentially a day where volunteers show up, go out and try and identify as many native plants and animals as they can. And it sort of provides a snapshot in time of what's in the property. And you can sort of see some of those things move throughout time. This is just a general overview of everything I talked about and just ways to get involved with NICHES. We're always looking for volunteers. A good way to get plugged into our volunteer program, if you go to our website online and just hit the volunteer tab, there's a volunteer registration that you can sign up for. That will sign you up for our Acorn newsletter that comes out at the beginning of each month, that has all the public volunteer workdays, any special workdays, and other events listed in it. So that's the best way if you want to get involved with some of this. And like I mentioned before, we have invasive plant treatment and removal during the entire growing season, trail creation and maintenance. We're looking for people to lead public hikes, doing what wildflower ID. Really, the sky's the limit on that. If you have a particular skill set that revolves around the natural world that you want to share with people, NICHES would be a wonderful place for you to put that to the test. We're looking for people to seed collection that usually happens later in the summer and early fall. We have our fire squad that takes place primarily in March, and sometimes we have some burns that we're able to do later. after the growing season has ended in October. Assisting in outreach year-round, the river and creek cleanups that happen later in the summer, and our internship opportunities. And this is actually a breakdown of the volunteer hours that we had in 2020. It's something this number has been bumping up every year, and I'm lucky enough to be in the position where I can sort of focus more on volunteer engagement, and these numbers have gone up. As you see on the top right, public volunteer work days was about 1,500 hours. Our independent volunteers actually clocked in over 2,000 hours. 2020, we only had 100 hours with our burn program, and that was more or less a result of COVID. We actually had to cut our spring burn program short because of the emerging coronavirus. Our site stewards put in 2,000 hours. Americorps, we actually had a group that we had for 1 week in the spring, and then COVID had them called back. And we were lucky enough to receive another group in the fall, a 6-person crew that we worked with, which provided the organization with around 1,200 hours. Our 2 interns, Zach Neff and Catherine Fisher, helped put in over 1,000 hours during the summer. Our Deer Call volunteers brought us 1,100 hours, and special projects was about 400 hours, and that's essentially work that we do with Purdue programs. We work with Epic capstone projects to help build bridges, just sort of special projects that don't fit well into these other categories. I believe in 2019, the final number that I had calculated out was around 2,000, 3,000 hours. And obviously, that's a really big jump up to 2020. For a full-time staff member, it's just a little bit over 2,000 hours a year. So obviously, when we're clocking in around 10,000 volunteer hours, that's another 5 staff members that the organization doesn't have to pay for. And that's also people who are going out and having these experiences on the land and are getting plugged into this culture. And it's something I really like to try and do with the volunteers, is try and explain what the long-term impacts of some of these things are. Obviously, if you're just showing up for a day to help with invasive removal or stacking or something like that, you're not seeing the day-to-day changes that are happening on the landscape that I'm, as somebody that works with niches every day, I get to see some of these. And I think that's really where my passion comes out for that, is when you see these long-term changes happening. And as we start to develop a culture around our volunteer program, some of our volunteers are starting to see that firsthand. And it's something that is really exciting for people. And it's, as we get more and more land and grow as an organization, we're only going to have more of a need for volunteers. So it's something I'm really, really appreciative to work with everybody on. It's an amazing job that I get to have. The people who come out, nobody volunteers their time for a land trust who isn't a good person. Nobody just goes and spends time out in the woods just because they don't want to. It's these people are great. I really love it, and it's an honor for me to do. So with that, I will open the floor to questions, and I guess I'll let Julie run that.
All right. Thanks so much, Sam. If you've got a question for him, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and just ask.
Hey, Sam.
Hey, Bill.
Hey. Thanks, Sam. That was a good presentation. One of your slides showed a seeder, a mechanical tractor seeder kind of thing down the lower left-hand side. I've never seen one of those before. Can you?
Yeah, so that is actually a picture that I cut out from our recent Shawnee Bottoms restoration. So that was a seeder that went through and was seeding the northern part of that restoration.
Okay.
Yeah, it's something you got to be careful to make sure that we do something called seed cleaning. So just picking the seeds off of the plant, if you run that through a seeder, it's something that's going to get gummed up and it'll just be a holy mess. So that's another thing that we work with volunteers, is actually to take that raw seed material that has a lot of chaff in it and actually go through, pick out the individual seeds. And it's amazing how much you can put 50 hours into something and you have this big of a bag, and then that boils down to something that's just under a pound, but per ounce, it's really valuable for us. So, yep, that's the seed drill in action.
Does it, so does it actually drill into the ground or?
Yeah, so the way it works, it's a bin. It's just sort of a large hopper that has these sort of arms that just sort of dig into the ground and plant 1 or 2 seeds, hopefully at a time. And then it's a way to plant a large area without using too much seed. Another way we do it without the seeder is just hand broadcasting seeds. Obviously that's not as homogeneous, but sometimes that's good. But it's a way to burn through more seeds, I think, sometimes when you're hand broadcasting, and it depends on how heavy a hand that everybody has.
Yeah,
Rod, did you want to ask a question?
Sorry, I'm just used to doing that in department meetings. So
Jump on in.
I have it.
Hey, Rod.
So thanks, Sam. I think what a great way to sort of encapsulate all the wonderful opportunities people have to volunteer. So thanks for putting this together for us. My question is, given the COVID constraints that we're all facing right now, at least now, and the I don't want to say competition for certain activities, let's say enthusiasm for certain activities over others, particularly ones that involve boats and water. What's your advice or strategy for, given that we have limited slots for those, to try? Do we just keep checking back or be the first person to respond, like on a call?
You gotta send in money, Rod. That's what you gotta do. we need the money rolling in. Yeah, obviously I don't think I've ever had a problem filling up a float. Yeah, it's a little bit harder to fill the garlic mustard pulling shifts.
Have you had to turn people away though? I think is Rod's.
Yeah, so like I said, we have 6 boats, like for something like a float. So we have limited capacity, and it's, for the most part, it's just first come, first serve.
So when you say boats, so is that a generic term, or as a floating device, or boats that you can put trash in?
Oh, so yeah, we have the ability to haul 6 canoes. Sometimes we have folks show up with other canoes, but yeah, we'll load up canoes, and it's amazing how much trash you can fit in a canoe. That's something I never understood before working with NICHES. And
I guess another way to ask, if we can provide our own floating device, whether it be a kayak or a canoe, would that open up a slot for us? And then we won't have a seat in a canoe. We can put trash in that person's seat. You see where I'm going?
Yeah. No, that would be perfect. We do. Yeah. Usually every year during the creek cleanups, we have folks who have their own boats show up, and that does open up another spot for somebody to use one of our boats, essentially. I think right now in the springtime, we have it set as 12 people per workday, but that's something we're expecting to increase as obviously as COVID continues to go away and people get vaccinated. So if you have your own boat, especially one that has a lot of room to haul junk, please show up and we'll put that to full use.
I'll just say, I think I've got in my lab, we've got 4 or 5 kayaks and a canoe and a john boat.
Oh,
that are all currently stored in my research shed. So keep me in mind.
I will. You'll be getting the email here later in the summer, Rod. Thank you.
Writing that down too.
Yeah.
I will say though, those are all in force after about August with Hellbender work starting up, but between now and August, they're readily available because we're not doing a whole lot in the river right now.
Perfect. I think our last, we do have some of the work or the creek cleanups happen in August. That's usually sort of end of August. And our last one is usually September 11th. We have our Wildcat Creek cleanup. So I will send you an email, and if you've got some extra boats and a crew, that would be fantastic, because for most of them, especially the Wildcat Creek ones, we usually end up with full boats at the end of it. Anybody else have any other questions?
What is a virtual Hellbender tour?
That sounds like a question for Rod.
Rod's made the statement, yes.
Well, I saw that he had the picture of a Hellbender on there, and then I didn't pay attention for about 10 minutes because my mind was distracted. No, I'm kidding. So here at Purdue, we have my lab. We rear about 1,000 hellbenders in captivity to be released into the Blue River in southern Indiana over the next 2 or 3 years. So
And what
I
is
did-
a hellbender?
it was that giant salamander that was one of the pictures on
Okay.
Sam's presentation. It's North America's largest amphibian, and it's an endangered salamander species here in Indiana. And so I just didn't know if that was a focal point of, you know, sort of endangered species, even though they don't occur this far north. It's still a great indicator of water quality, but I was just offering that up as if we want to use that as a platform, at least virtually now, because we can't get into the facility with COVID restrictions at Purdue. But we can provide a tour and sort of talk about what we're doing with hellbenders and in conservation. And because many of the things that NICHES is doing up here, we're working with the Nature Conservancy in southern Indiana and the Blue River to do various things specifically with that species in mind. So anyway.
Okay, thank you, Rod.
You're welcome.
In case anybody was wondering, Rod was one of my professors when I was a wildlife undergrad at Purdue. And
And I will have to say, you did an excellent job on your presentation. Not that I was evaluating you and giving you a grade, but you have done very well, Sam.
Oh, thank you. You can still grade me. That's all right. Especially if it's a good one, I'll take it. And I did win his, it was the Herpathon up at the summer practicum we had in Wisconsin. Something I'm still very proud of and think about from time to time today. Anybody else have any other questions? These Zoom presentations are always so weird. It's just too quiet. I recently had to give a presentation to the Environmental Science Club at Purdue, and I was trying to give it from my home up in Warren County, which has really spotty cell service and Wi-Fi. And I wasn't able to do the actual Zoom presentation, so I just had a call in. And I gave the entire presentation and got to the end of it, and everybody was muted, and nobody said anything for like 40 seconds after I ended. And I was like, oh my God, the call must have cut out or something. And then somebody finally started talking, and it was like every joke that you say just totally falls flat because there's nobody there to laugh at it. And it was like, I'm ready for the world to get back to in person. So if you are eligible for your shot, please get it. I'll be getting mine here soon.
Thank you, Sam. I especially liked your comment that anybody that gets involved with NICHES is good people.
They most certainly are. I don't think I've met any bad people that I've worked with. It's people like that. You don't spend your own personal time helping the environmental world if there's kind of hard to come up with an ulterior motive for that one.
Any other questions or comments before we wrap up tonight? All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. And all of you will receive an email in the coming days from me with a link to this recording. I will also include the link to the volunteer form that Sam spoke about earlier in the presentation as well. And you can always reach back out to Sam, Gus, or any of the other staff with questions should you have them. So.
Yep. The email is sam@nicheslandtrust.org. And if you have a particular itching to go out and pull garlic mustard here soon, I would really love to hear from you. I need to get all those shifts filled.
Thanks, Sam and Julie. Really good.
Yeah, thank you, Bill.